America has always loved the sound of its own promises. Freedom, equality, opportunity. These words are woven into its history, its speeches, its symbols. Yet James Baldwin asked a question few were willing to face. What happens when a nation built on freedom depends on the denial of freedom to survive? Baldwin did not speak from distance or theory. He spoke from experience. He grew up knowing that liberty was celebrated loudly, but offered selectively. He saw how the same language of courage and resistance was praised when spoken by some, and condemned when spoken by others. In that contradiction, Baldwin recognized the quiet engine of injustice, not just hatred, but denial, a refusal to see fully, honestly, and humanly. What made Baldwin dangerous to complacency was not anger alone, but clarity. He refused simple villains and easy comfort. He insisted that the problem was not only cruelty, but the stories a country tells itself to justify that cruelty. Stories that turn people into symbols, reduce lives to stereotypes, and label resistance as disorder rather than dignity. Baldwin understood that when a society criminalizes the demand for equality, it reveals more about its fears than its values. This story is not about the past being safely buried. It is about a truth that keeps returning, because it was never resolved. Baldwin believed that facing this truth was not an act of betrayal, but an act of love. Love strong enough to demand better. Love brave enough to tell the truth without flinching. If you are ready to step into a story that challenges comforting myths and asks deeper questions about freedom, identity, and responsibility, stay with us. And if you value stories that refuse silence and invite honest reflection, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter in this journey of truth. The contradiction James Baldwin would later expose to the world did not begin in courtrooms, classrooms, or televised debates. It began quietly, in the narrow rooms of a Harlem apartment where space was scarce, tempers were tight, and survival itself demanded constant negotiation. The nation outside spoke endlessly about freedom, but inside Baldwin's childhood, freedom was fragile, conditional, and often out of reach. Poverty was not an abstract idea. It was the daily arithmetic of hunger, overcrowding, and exhaustion. Every hallway, every stairwell, every street carried the unspoken lesson that life was already constrained before it truly began. Religion, meant to offer refuge, became another form of discipline. Baldwin's stepfather ruled the household with rigid certainty, using faith as both shield and weapon. Scripture was not a source of comfort but a set of boundaries that left little room for curiosity, tenderness, or questioning. Silence was expected. Obedience demanded. Yet even as a child, Baldwin sensed the danger hidden in that quiet. He could feel how easily unspoken fear hardened into bitterness, how unchallenged authority turned into control rather than care. Watching his father struggle under pressures he could neither name nor escape, Baldwin learned that enforced silence did not protect the soul. It slowly crushed it. Outside the apartment, Harlem offered its own lessons. Music spilled into the streets, laughter cut through the noise, and life pulsed with creativity and resilience. But beneath the rhythm lived another truth. Racism shaped the boundaries of opportunity, just as tightly as poverty shaped the walls of his home. Baldwin observed how dignity was rationed, how humiliation was normalized, and how expectations were quietly lowered for people who looked like him. He noticed which lives were guarded and which were treated as expendable. Long before he had the language to describe it, Baldwin understood that injustice thrived not only through violence, but through neglect and indifference. Books became his escape. And later, his defiance. Forbidden or discouraged, they offered him a world where thought could move freely, where ideas were not confined by fear or authority. Reading in secret, Baldwin discovered something transformative. Words could name what others avoided, could expose what silence tried to hide. Writing followed naturally, not as ambition, but as necessity. It was a way to breathe, to make sense of a world that demanded endurance without explanation. Each sentence became a refusal to disappear, a quiet resistance against forces that insisted he remain small and unseen. When Baldwin stepped into the pulpit as a teenager, his voice carried a power that startled even him. The cadence, the urgency, the ability to hold a room, all of it hinted at what would come. But faith alone could not contain the questions burning inside him. He saw how sermons could move hearts without changing structures, how spiritual comfort could coexist with social cruelty. Leaving the church was not a rejection of meaning, but a recognition of limits. Baldwin had learned that survival required more than belief. It required truth. By the time he reached adulthood, the lesson was clear and irreversible. Silence was not neutrality. It was participation in the lie. The poverty of his childhood, the rigidity of religion, the daily encounters with racism had taught him that surrender often arrived disguised as patience. Baldwin chose another path. He would speak, write, and remember, not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. In learning to survive Harlem, he learned something larger about America itself. That freedom without honesty was an illusion, and that finding one's voice was the first act of resistance. From the narrow streets of Harlem to the dimly lit corners of overcrowded apartments, James Baldwin discovered early that the world often refused to acknowledge him, yet he refused to vanish into its indifference. School promised knowledge but delivered something far more insidious. Lessons that celebrated a version of history and society that systematically excluded people like him. A version that whispered in every textbook and lesson that his worth was measured by how closely he could fit into someone else's story. The classrooms, instead of nurturing curiosity, often highlighted absence. And Baldwin, even as a felt the weight of the omissions. The quiet erasures that shaped a reality meant to contain him. It was within this constricted landscape that reading became more than escape. It became a lifeline, a means of reclaiming a self that society sought to keep invisible. Books spoke in voices that refused to diminish his existence, that narrated the humanity of people who had been written out of dominant narratives. And Baldwin absorbed each word with the urgency of someone staking a claim to life itself. Writing emerged not as a hobby or a mere pastime, but as a form of resistance, a declaration that his mind, his observations, and his experiences were valuable and undeniable. When Baldwin put pen to paper, he was not merely telling a story. He was mapping a territory that had been denied him in classrooms, in streets, in the assumptions of a nation that claimed freedom while codifying inequality. Each essay, each story, each reflection became an act of reclamation, a refusal to allow the distortions and omissions of others to define who he was. The act of writing allowed him to interrogate the contradictions he witnessed daily. The way, custom, and social expectation could enshrine injustice while preaching morality, and to expose the gap between America's promises and its practices. Through words, he could carve out a space where truth mattered, where complexity could be acknowledged, and where the hidden and silenced experiences of Black life could take form and be recognized. Baldwin's education outside of school, in the quiet study of literature, philosophy, and human expression, shaped a mind that would refuse compromise in the face of falsehood. He read voraciously, absorbing the insights of writers who had confronted oppression in myriad forms, discovering that language could illuminate both the subtleties of injustice and the resilience required to confront it. The stories he consumed became mirrors and windows, mirrors reflecting aspects of himself and his community, and windows opening onto worlds where intellect, courage, and moral clarity were wielded against oppression. Writing, then, became the natural extension of this literary immersion, a method of engaging with reality as it was, unflinching, unromanticized, yet infused with the hope that articulation could inspire change. Baldwin's sentences were carefully honed instruments, capable of dissecting social structures, of challenging assumptions, and of drawing readers into the urgent moral terrain he navigated daily. In reclaiming the identity denied to him by American education, Baldwin also reclaimed agency, refusing to let a system designed to marginalize dictate his self-perception. Each story, essay, and reflection became an assertion that he existed, that his observations were valid, that his voice demanded attention. Reading and writing were intertwined with survival, for to survive in a society that minimized him required understanding, articulation, and the courage to name injustice without fear of erasure. They became shields and swords, protecting his sense of self while challenging the narratives imposed upon him, and ultimately laid the foundation for a lifetime of engagement with truth. Through this disciplined cultivation of language and thought, Baldwin not only endured, but he prepared to speak for others, to expose contradictions, and to insist that the humanity of those denied recognition be acknowledged, understood, and remembered. As Baldwin navigated the streets of Harlem and later other corners of the country and world, the weight of loss and the echoes of violence became impossible to ignore, shaping his consciousness with an intensity that left no room for indifference. Friends and family were touched by hardships that seemed to arrive with relentless frequency, while the broader black community endured assaults both overt and insidious, from systemic discrimination to sudden, senseless acts of aggression that left bodies broken and spirits scarred. Baldwin witnessed, with the unflinching clarity of someone who refused to look away, the ripple effects of cruelty and neglect, the way fear and grief could settle into everyday life, constraining possibility and eroding hope. Each encounter with suffering, each story of injustice, became more than observation. It became an ethical summons, a call that demanded acknowledgement, reflection, and articulation. In a society that preferred silence, Baldwin recognized that failing to speak was not neutral. It was a form of complicity, a tacit consent to the perpetuation of harm, and he understood early that remaining quiet was a luxury he could not afford if he intended to live with integrity. The tragedies that marked his personal life, loss, alienation, and the constant negotiation of a world built to minimize him, intertwined with the collective trauma of his community, producing a profound awareness of interconnectedness and moral responsibility. Baldwin understood that the pain inflicted on one life was never isolated, that every act of oppression resonated beyond its immediate victim. Shaping consciousness, expectations, and futures. This awareness transformed his writing into a conduit for both witness and witness-bearing, a space in which suffering could be named, contextualized, and transformed into insight rather than despair. Truth-telling, therefore, was not an artistic choice or rhetorical strategy. It became a moral imperative, the only viable response to a world in which injustice sought to normalize itself and erase accountability. Each essay, each speech, each story was undergirded by the conviction that honesty, even when uncomfortable or unsettling, was a form of resistance, a tool that could illuminate systemic cruelty and validate experiences often dismissed or ignored. Through his works, Baldwin gave voice to the unspoken grief and anger that pulsed through the Black experience, refusing the false consolations of denial or evasion. He chronicled the impact of violence not as abstract statistics but as lived reality, portraying the subtle and overt ways oppression infiltrated families, schools, and neighborhoods, and the toll it exacted on identity, aspiration, and self-worth. His narratives carried the weight of witnessing, Yet they were never purely mournful. They demanded engagement, empathy, and reckoning. By intertwining the personal and the communal, Baldwin demonstrated that truth-telling was not just a method of documentation but an ethical stance, a commitment to rendering the unseen seen and the silenced audible. Every sentence he crafted was imbued with the urgency of this responsibility, capturing the rhythms of life shaped by loss, survival, and defiance, and underscoring that in a world inclined toward obfuscation, clarity itself could be revolutionary. Baldwin's insistence on confronting these realities reflected a deep understanding that narrative could serve as both shield and beacon, safeguarding memory while guiding attention to moral and social imperatives that demanded recognition. In speaking the truths of his community and his own experiences, he forged connections across isolation, transforming personal anguish into a collective call for awareness and action. The violence he observed, the tragedies he endured, and the ethical clarity he embraced became inseparable from his identity as a writer and thinker, embedding in his work a relentless pursuit of honesty that challenged readers to confront discomfort, question complicity, and honor the dignity of those whose stories were too often ignored. In Baldwin's world, to speak truth was to act with conscience, to refuse erasure, and to insist that the human cost of injustice be acknowledged, remembered, and ultimately confronted. Baldwin's departure from America, settling in the streets and cafes of Paris, marked a profound shift in both his perspective and his craft, allowing him to confront the nation he loved with unflinching clarity. The physical distance granted him an unusual kind of vision, one in which the familiar textures of Harlem, the rhythms of southern towns, and the relentless pressures of American life could be observed without the constant intrusion of fear and expectation. In Paris, he could walk freely, speak openly, and think without the weight of immediate judgment. And in this freedom, he discovered the space to interrogate America in ways that might have been impossible had he remained confined by its social and racial constraints. Exile was not merely a geographical relocation. It was an act of intellectual liberation, an opportunity to step outside the habitual narratives imposed by society and examine the contradictions that lay at the heart of the nation. The promises of liberty alongside the persistence of oppression, the ideal of equality shadowed by the reality of marginalization. In this liminal space, Baldwin's mind moved with a rare clarity, tracing the contours of injustice, the echoes of violence, and the invisible burdens carried by generations of Black Americans, while simultaneously contemplating the broader human condition and the ways in which fear, prejudice, and indifference shape society at large. Paris offered Baldwin encounters with other exiles, artists, and thinkers, a community in which ideas flowed freely, challenged convention, and nurtured creativity. The cafes became laboratories of thought, spaces where he could dissect language, culture, and power, and where the conversation about identity and freedom could unfold without the relentless pressures of American prejudice. Here, Baldwin honed his voice, learning to articulate experiences that were at once deeply personal and profoundly universal, recognizing that his observations of American society would resonate far beyond the borders of the country that had shaped him. Distance amplified perception. He could analyze the legal structures, the social norms, and the moral contradictions with both intimacy and detachment, transforming lived experience into literature that was both piercing and elegant. Each essay, each novel, each speech carried the weight of this dual vision, the immediacy of memory entwined with the reflective insight that only exile could provide, giving his work a depth and resonance that demanded attention and reflection. In Paris, Baldwin's writing became a means of reconciliation, a bridge between his homeland and his conscience, between the reality of oppression and the possibilities of justice. He explored the complexities of race, sexuality, and humanity with an honesty that might have been too dangerous to pursue openly in America. And yet he never allowed physical distance to diminish his engagement with the struggles of his people. On the contrary, separation intensified his commitment to truth, enabling him to critique, illuminate, and challenge from a position of both safety and responsibility. His observations were unsentimental yet empathetic, unflinching yet compassionate, revealing the profound costs of systemic injustice while insisting upon the dignity and resilience of those who endured it. Baldwin's exile was, paradoxically, a form of intimacy. By stepping away, he could see the interconnections, the contradictions, and the possibilities of transformation with a lucidity that made his work not merely a record of experience, but a powerful call to consciousness and conscience. Through the lens of Paris, Baldwin's America came into focus as a land of promise and betrayal, a country whose ideals were too often betrayed by its actions, and yet one that could be imagined differently through the lens of critical, uncompromising thought. The freedom to write without fear, the ability to interrogate memory and society, and the distance to observe without immediate threat allowed Baldwin to transform personal exile into collective insight, crafting works that were as much about the moral imperatives of humanity as they were about the specific struggles of Black Americans. In this city of refuge, Baldwin became both witness and interpreter, translating the raw truths of oppression into narratives that illuminated, challenged, and ultimately demanded that readers confront the world as it was, even as they imagined what it could become. Baldwin's ascent as a literary and moral voice unfolded through works that were as intensely personal as they were universally resonant. With novels like Go Tell It on the Mountain and essays collected in The Fire Next Time establishing him not merely as a storyteller, but as a witness to the deeper truths of American life and the human condition. In Go Tell It on the Mountain, he delved into the complex interplay of family, religion, and racial identity, drawing on his own experiences in Harlem to illuminate how personal suffering and societal oppression intertwined, shaping the lives of those who, like him, navigated the precarious boundaries between faith, freedom, and selfhood. Through the character of John Grimes, Baldwin explored the burdens of inherited trauma, the moral and emotional conflicts of growing up Black in America, and the ways in which young lives were molded by both love and constraint, hope and fear. Every page carried the weight of history, every paragraph a reflection of the intimate and systemic forces that conspired to define a person's place in the world. And through his prose, Baldwin allowed readers to witness the fragile courage required to confront these realities. In The Fire Next Time, Baldwin sharpened his moral lens, combining the immediacy of personal narrative with a prophetic clarity that examined the national conscience. Writing directly to both Black and white Americans, he insisted on confronting the uncomfortable truths of racial injustice, the enduring legacy of slavery, and the illusions of freedom that had long masked systemic oppression. His essays did not merely recount suffering, they interrogated the moral responsibility of every individual in a society structured around inequality, asking readers to examine their complicity, their biases, and the ways in which culture and law reinforced hierarchies of power. Baldwin's voice, lyrical yet piercing, carried the authority of lived experience and the urgency of ethical clarity, making the personal political and the political profoundly human. Across both works, the tension between hope and despair, love and anger, memory and imagination, created a narrative tapestry that was simultaneously intimate and expansive, demonstrating how literature could serve as a mirror to society while challenging it to envision something better. Baldwin's role as a global moral witness extended beyond the written page. His works traveled across borders and generations, resonating with readers who recognized in his insights a reflection of struggles not confined to America alone. He became a figure who could articulate the pain of marginalized communities, the contradictions of democratic ideals, and the enduring necessity of justice with a clarity that was as intellectually rigorous as it was emotionally compelling. In interviews, speeches, and essays, he carried the same intensity that marked his fiction, translating the texture of Harlem streets, the weight of Southern oppression, and the complexity of identity into a language that demanded recognition and response. Baldwin's genius lay not only in his capacity to depict suffering or injustice, but in his insistence on connecting individual experience to collective conscience, in showing that the truths of one life reflected broader societal patterns, and that understanding, empathy, and action were inseparable from moral insight. Through the continuity of his work, Baldwin created a literary and ethical framework that invited readers to witness, reflect, and engage. He demonstrated that stories about race, identity, and power were not abstract concepts, but lived realities that required acknowledgement, understanding, and response. The universality of his vision, grounded in the particularity of his own journey, allowed Baldwin to transcend the limitations of his immediate context, positioning him as a chronicler of truth whose moral authority extended far beyond his own time. Each novel, essay, and public address reinforced the imperative that justice, empathy, and clarity of thought were inseparable from the act of living responsibly in a world marked by inequality and contradiction. Through these major works, Baldwin became not merely an observer of his society, but a vital interpreter of its moral and ethical dimensions, ensuring that his voice would continue to challenge, illuminate, and inspire long after the pages were read and the speeches were heard. As the 1960s unfolded and the civil rights movement surged across the United States, Baldwin's presence was not merely that of an observer but of an unflinching witness whose eyes had long been trained to detect both overt and insidious forms of injustice. From the streets of Harlem to the segregated towns of the South, he moved through spaces marked by tension, courage, and the unrelenting demand for change, documenting with unerring clarity what so many preferred to ignore or rationalize. Baldwin's writings from this period pulse with the immediacy of lived experience, capturing the anguish of families torn apart by systemic oppression, the anger and exhaustion of communities striving for recognition, and the persistent denial of the nation's professed ideals of liberty and equality. He confronted the complacency of politicians and intellectuals alike, refusing the convenient abstractions that reduced human suffering to statistics or moral platitudes, and insisting instead on the raw, often uncomfortable truths of life under racial subjugation. In doing, Baldwin carved a path that neither flinched from criticizing white society for its enduring complicity nor succumbed to simplistic prescriptions for black identity or solidarity, understanding that authentic liberation required honesty, introspection, and moral courage across all lines of race and class. Baldwin's interactions with civil rights leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens alike allowed him to translate the urgency of protest into prose and public discourse, bridging the gap between action and reflection. He recognized that the movement's victories and failures were entwined with the broader narrative of America, and that each act of resistance carried moral, social, and psychological consequences that demanded careful reckoning. Baldwin's essays and speeches during this period carry a dual weight. They record the moment in history with vivid immediacy while simultaneously urging readers to confront their own roles within the systems of power that produced injustice. He exposed the moral contradictions of a nation that celebrated freedom while enforcing inequality, and he challenged the movement itself to grapple with internal tensions, dogmas, and the temptation to settle for symbolic rather than substantive change. Through his uncompromising gaze, Baldwin made clear that liberation was not simply the end of segregation or the passage of laws, but the transformation of consciousness, the recognition of shared humanity, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths without retreating into denial or defensiveness. The moral and artistic intensity Baldwin brought to this era ensured that his work transcended the temporal confines of the 1960s, speaking to both the immediacy of civil rights struggles and the enduring necessity of ethical vigilance. By refusing to simplify the complex realities of racial life, he produced writings that were at once intimate and panoramic. Blending reportage, memoir, and literary reflection into a seamless testament to human dignity under duress, Baldwin's voice became a conduit for both empathy and accountability, articulating the psychic and structural violence inflicted upon black communities while demanding that white society recognize the stakes of its inaction. Even as he witnessed protests, arrests, and the brutal repression of demonstrators, Baldwin maintained a critical independence, resisting both sentimental heroization of black leaders and reductive condemnation of white oppressors, insisting that moral clarity required discernment, nuance, and unflinching honesty. In chronicling the era's struggles and contradictions, he created a body of work that functioned as both mirror and warning, a record that continues to challenge readers to confront injustice, question assumptions, and engage with the complexities of human freedom, power, and responsibility. Through Baldwin's witness, the civil rights era is rendered not merely as a historical moment, but as a living ethical and cultural conversation, one that continues to demand reflection, action, and the courage to speak truth to power. As we reflect on James Baldwin's life and work, it becomes clear that his legacy is not confined to the pages of his essays, novels, or speeches, but lives on as a persistent call to action, a moral compass urging each of us to face the uncomfortable truths that society often prefers to ignore. Baldwin challenged generations to look beyond the comforting myths of American exceptionalism and to confront the deep-rooted structures of racism, inequality, and injustice that continue to shape our world. His insistence on truth-telling, no matter how painful or inconvenient, reminds us that genuine progress demands courage, honesty, and an unwavering commitment to human dignity. Baldwin's words encourage us to interrogate not only the systems of oppression around us, but also the ways in which we, consciously or unconsciously, participate in them. He teaches that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and that love and empathy must guide both our understanding and our actions. Even decades after his passing, Baldwin's insight resonates powerfully in contemporary society, where racial tensions, social inequities, and cultural divisions remain ever present. His writing transcends time and geography because it addresses the universal human struggle for recognition, belonging, and moral integrity. Through his relentless examination of identity, power, and conscience, Baldwin provides a lens through which we can better understand our collective responsibilities. His life demonstrates that the pursuit of justice is neither simple nor comfortable. It requires a willingness to confront painful realities, challenge personal biases, and engage in difficult conversations with integrity and humility. In embracing Baldwin's call, we honor not only his memory but also the countless individuals who continue to fight for equity, dignity, and freedom. Thank you so much for joining me in exploring the remarkable life and enduring impact of James Baldwin. If you found this journey insightful and inspiring, please consider supporting the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you never miss a story that illuminates history, culture, and the human experience. Together, we can continue to learn from voices like Baldwin's and take meaningful steps toward a more just and compassionate world. Let us carry forward his message of courage, honesty, and love, remembering that each of us has a role to play in confronting injustice and building a society that lives up to its highest ideals.